Darkness fell quickly, and the wind whipped through the empty streets around the apartment complex, carrying the eerie hum of a winter night. Amid the pitch-black city, the faint flicker of a street lamp outside the garage was the only light guiding Sophie. Her boots thudded heavily over the wet pavement, leaving uneven prints that mirrored the chaos inside her. The air was so cold her breath turned to wisps of mist, but she barely noticed. She had to reach the garage now. The rusted metal door creaked open, its prolonged groan echoing like a protest against her arrival. Sophie paused, holding her breath. In the dim streetlight, she saw Milo, broad and striking, standing motionless in the garage's center. But something felt wrong. Milo didn't step toward her as usual, nor did he offer a familiar sound of greeting. Instead, his sharp gray eyes fixed on a shadowy corner, as if something hid there. Sophie swallowed hard, unease tightening her throat. "Milo," she whispered, her voice rough with tension. But he didn't react, his gaze steady on the darkness. She took slow, cautious steps toward him, her trembling hand reaching for his arm. She felt the stiffness in his frame, his muscles taut as if poised to flee, yet his eyes remained locked on that dark corner. Following his stare, she peered into the shadows. A faint rustling broke the silence. Soft at first, like a breeze through a crack, then louder, like something shifting across the concrete. Sophie stepped back, a chill racing down her spine. "Is someone there?" Her voice cracked the stillness, small and shaky, swallowed by the vast garage. No answer came. Then suddenly a hand shot from the darkness, gripping a metal shelf. Sophie gasped, stumbling backward, nearly falling. A figure emerged, their face half lit. Clara, but not the calm, composed Clara she knew. Her eyes were wide with panic, her lips trembling as if words wouldn't form. "Clara, what are you doing here this late?" Sophie demanded, her voice still quaking. Clara stepped forward, her right hand clutching something, hiding it. She faltered, caught between explanation and dread, but before Sophie could press her, the garage door, left ajar, slammed shut with a jarring bang. Both women flinched, their eyes darting to the door. The street lamp swayed outside, casting wild patterns of light and shadow that heightened the tension. "Who's there?" Sophie shouted, her voice cutting through the thick silence. For a moment there was nothing. Then footsteps sounded outside, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel, growing closer. Clara moved in front of Sophie, her stance rigid and protective. "Stay back," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority Sophie hadn't heard before. "I'll handle this." "No," Sophie replied, shaking her head, her resolve hardening despite the fear. At 25, she'd come to the garage seeking solace in Milo, but now something darker loomed. Clara's panicked presence hinted at secrets, and the approaching steps, Ethan's perhaps, threatened to unravel everything. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and Sophie braced herself. Whatever waited outside, whoever it was, she couldn't hide from it. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door, and the silence pressed in, thick with anticipation. "I can't just stand here, Milo," Sophie began, but Clara cut in, her eyes locking onto Sophie's with an intensity that silenced her. "Listen to me, Sophie. If it's who I think it is, you don't want to get involved. Sophie blinked, stunned. Who you think it is? Clara, what are you talking about? Do you know who's out there? Clara didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward the garage door, her body tense as the footsteps halted just outside. Whoever it was stood in silence beyond the thin metal barrier. Sophie and Clara froze, their hearts pounding so fiercely it seemed to echo through the garage. The noise outside had stopped, but the air thickened with a suffocating tension. Sophie's hands trembled despite her efforts to steady them. Clara's gaze was razor sharp, tinged with fear and something elusive. Almost as if she hid a secret Sophie wasn't meant to uncover. "We have to go out there," Clara said, her voice low but firm. "If someone's there, we need to know what they're up to." Sophie shook her head, her breaths quick and shallow. Just then, a loud clang erupted from within the garage. Both women stiffened, turning toward the sound. It was Milo. He let out a sharp, guttural cry, shattering the oppressive quiet. The force of it jolted Sophie, and for a fleeting moment, her fear loosened its grip. Seizing the chance, she broke free from her paralysis and darted toward Milo. He thrashed inside, slamming his broad frame against the garage walls as if desperate to escape. His gray eyes blazed with wild determination, his movements frantic as though he meant to shield her. Sophie reached the door, slamming it shut behind her, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. She glanced back. Clara was gone, vanished into the night as if she'd never been there. Sophie sank to the ground, her chest heaving as adrenaline surged through her. "Clara," she whispered, tears streaking her face, "where are you?" Her voice cracked under the weight of despair, but no answer came. No trace of Clara anywhere. For a moment she sat there, the faint street lamp glow outside doing little to pierce the storm of questions swirling in her mind. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps, her heart hammering as if it might break free. She pressed against the garage door, struggling to steady herself, but the image of that shadowy figure lingered, vivid and haunting, as if still lurking behind her. Inside, Milo hadn't calmed. His panic cries reverberated in the dark, his gray eyes glinting with fear. His restless movements shook the concrete, his muscles taut, as if warning her of a threat she couldn't yet see. "Clara," Sophie whispered again, her voice trembling, but silence swallowed her plea. She slid down, hugging her knees, trying to convince herself Clara was safe, that the figure was just a random passerby. Deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Something was unfolding, something she couldn't fully grasp but felt as sharply as the icy wind cutting through the night. Another sound snapped her back to reality, this time from the apartment. A faint glow spilled from the living room window. Sophie's head jerked toward it, her eyes widening with dread. At 25, she'd sought refuge in the garage with Milo, but now the shadows pressed in, and the approaching unknown, Ethan perhaps, threatened to unravel her fragile world. Ethan. The thought of her partner jolted Sophie into action. He might still be there, might help her find Clara, or at least face the shadowy figure from the garage. Despite the growing distance between them, Sophie had no other option. She ran toward the apartment, her boots splashing through icy puddles, each step a sharp ache in her chest, a blend of exhaustion and dread for Clara's safety. She burst through the front door, her heavy footsteps echoing in the unnervingly quiet space. "Ethan!" she called, her voice hoarse with fear and strain. No response. The apartment was eerily still, so silent she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She rushed into the living room, where a desk lamp cast a warm glow across the room. Ethan's laptop sat open on the desk, its screen flickering with patient charts and schedules, but Ethan was nowhere in sight. "Ethan, where are you?" Sophie called again, her voice softer now, weaker, as if the first shout had sapped her strength. She climbed the stairs, flinging open door after door, but he wasn't there. Ethan was gone. Sophie paused on the landing, hands gripping the railing for support. She bowed her head, trying to think clearly. Maybe he'd left earlier, as he often did, vanishing without a word. Yet something felt off. Not just his absence, but the air itself, heavy and still, as if the apartment hid a secret. She returned to the living room, her eyes scanning the desk almost absently until they landed on something. A photograph, face down on the surface. Her chest tightened. Ethan never kept personal photos on his desk, but this one seemed deliberately placed, concealed. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, flipping it over. What she saw nearly made her drop it. In the photo was Ethan, but not with her. Standing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, was Clara. Sophie's face flushed hot as if struck. Was this an old picture or message? Her mind raced, grasping for answers. Clara had never hinted at any tie to Ethan, but now fragments clicked into place. Clara's odd silences, the cold glances she'd sometimes thrown Ethan's way, and now this image. Anger surged through Sophie, tempered only by the piercing sting of betrayal. She gripped the photo tightly, knuckles whitening. She was about to storm out to confront Clara when a noise stopped her cold. The front door opened and closed. Sophie spun around, eyes wide. Ethan walked in, his face registering surprise as he saw her clutching the photograph. He hesitated, then stepped toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Sophie." Ethan's voice broke the silence, calm but laced with fatigue. "What are you doing with that photo?" "Ethan," Sophie replied, her voice quivering with rage and the heartbreak tightening her throat. "You and Clara, what is this? This photo, what does it mean?" She thrust the picture forward as if she might hurl it at him, but Ethan stood still, watching her without a word. "Answer me," Sophie's voice broke, tears streaming down her face. "Who is she to you? Why is she here? Does she know everything about me? Is she why you've been so distant?" Ethan sighed, lifting a hand to his temple as if to ease a buried truth. At 25, Sophie had sought solace elsewhere, but now, faced with this evidence, the weight of Ethan's secrets pressed down, unraveling the fragile threads of their life together. "Sophie, you don't understand," Ethan said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, fueling her anger further. "Clara and we have a past, but it's not what you think." "Not what I think? Then explain it to me." Sophie stepped closer, her tear-filled eyes piercing his. Explain why she's here. Why she says things you never do. Ethan fell silent for a moment, then sighed, his shoulders sagging. I brought Clara in because I knew she could help you, he said finally, meeting her gaze. I knew you were lonely, Sophie. I knew I'd hurt you. Clara was the only one I thought could help you find yourself again. Sophie stood stunned, his words cutting into her like a blade. Help me? She echoed, her voice low and choked. You never thought to help me yourself? Why her? Ethan didn't answer, and Sophie realized she'd never get the explanation she craved. Without a word, she turned, clutching the photograph tightly, and stormed out of the apartment. Ethan remained alone in the dim light. Outside, the wind howled, slicing through her jacket and chilling her to the bone. Sophie ran toward the garage where she'd left Milo, but when she arrived, the door hung wide open. She stopped short, her heart pounding. The garage was empty. Milo was gone. Sophie stood frozen before the open door, the cold air wrapping around her like a suffocating veil. The wind whispered eerily through the streets. Milo, the one she'd come to believe understood her better than anyone, had vanished. Panic surged through her. Milo wouldn't leave on his own, not after his earlier agitation. This wasn't random. Milo! Sophie's voice rang into the dark expanse, but only the wind replied. She bolted from the garage, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of him. Footprints in the wet pavement led away, toward the narrow alley behind the complex. She hesitated, legs trembling from cold and fear, but she knew if she didn't act, she might lose Milo forever. Her boots sank into the damp ground as she followed the tracks, each step heavier than the last. The alley loomed closer, its cluttered shadows swallowing the faint streetlight, cloaking the path in thick darkness. The wind hissed through the buildings like murmurs from an unseen world, but Sophie pressed on, her focus locked on finding Milo. A faint sound broke the eerie quiet, a soft, strained cry from ahead. Sophie's heart leapt. It was Milo. Milo, she called, her voice blending desperation and relief. She quickened her pace, ignoring the ache in her legs. The cry came again, guiding her to a small opening in the alley. Streetlight filtered through the buildings, casting a dim, ghostly glow on the scene. There he was, Milo. But he wasn't alone. Sophie halted. Beside him stood a tall figure, their back to her. The faint light revealed little, but their commanding presence sent a chill down her spine. "Who's there?" Sophie shouted, her voice quaking with fear and fury. The figure turned slowly. It wasn't Ethan, nor the shadowy man she'd glimpsed earlier. His face, pale and almost otherworldly in the dim light, sent shivers through her. At 25, Sophie had sought solace in Milo, but now, facing this stranger, the fragile refuge she'd built unraveled. Her breath caught as she stared, the weight of Ethan's betrayal and Clara's secrets colliding with this new, unsettling mystery in the cold night air. His eyes, unnaturally bright and cold, locked onto hers with a calm that felt far from comforting. A faint, mysterious smile curved his lips, but he said nothing. Milo stood still beside him, eerily composed, as if already at ease with the man's presence. "Who are you? What are you doing with Milo?" Sophie demanded, forcing herself to step forward despite every instinct urging her to flee. The man didn't reply. Instead, he gently ran his hand along Milo's arm, his movements slow and almost tender. "You've come farther than I expected, Sophie," he said at last, his voice deep and strange, as if he knew her every secret. Sophie froze, her breath catching. How did he know her name? She'd never seen him before. She took another hesitant step, but his gaze halted her. It wasn't just cold, it was piercing, as if he could unravel her soul and expose every hidden truth. "Milo belongs to me," he said, his tone steady and unperturbed, as if her presence were insignificant. "He always has. You're just passing through, a fleeting visitor in his life." "No," Sophie's voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes from frustration and despair. "Milo doesn't belong to you. You have no right. He's all I have left." Her voice broke and tears streamed down her face, unstoppable. The man remained silent, his expression a blend of pity and detachment. "Sophie," he said softly, almost kindly, "you don't understand, do you? This was never about you. It's about what you've forgotten, what you're running from." His words sliced through her, leaving her speechless. Paralyzed, Sophie couldn't respond. The man turned back to Milo, giving a gentle tug, guiding him toward the deeper shadows of the alley. "Wait!" Sophie cried, lunging forward, but her legs felt anchored, immobile. He glanced back one last time, that cryptic smile lingering. "If you want to find Milo," he said, "find yourself first. Otherwise, everything will slip away." Then, like a phantom, he and Milo vanished into the darkness. Sophie collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving, heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind reeled with questions. How did he know her name? Who was he? Where had he taken Milo? When Sophie finally dragged herself back to the apartment, her legs barely holding her up, everything had changed. The garage stood empty, the apartment shrouded in shadow, and Ethan was nowhere to be found. Stepping into the living room, her eyes fell on the desk. The photograph of Ethan and Clara was gone, replaced by another. This one showed her and Milo, but something was off. Her face in the image was blank, her eyes hollow and lifeless, while Milo's gaze was sharp, penetrating, staring straight at her as if trying to speak. Sophie's hands trembled as she lifted the photo, nearly dropping it from the shaking in her fingers. She flipped it over. Scrawled on the back in jagged handwriting were the words, "Find the truth within yourself before it's too late." Sophie stumbled back, her breath snagging in her throat. The walls seemed to close in, the silence no longer just quiet but oppressive, suffocating. She spun around, her instincts screaming that something or someone watched her. For the first time, at 25, Sophie realized the darkness around her wasn't mere absence of light. It was alive, a force consuming everything she thought she knew. The encounter in the alley, Milo's disappearance, and now this haunting photo left her unmoored. Who was that man? What was Milo's true role in her life? Could she uncover the truth, or would she drown in this ever-deepening mystery? The story ends here, leaving Sophie haunted by questions without answers, and the audience gripped, pondering the man's identity, Milo's purpose, and whether Sophie can find herself or lose everything to the shadows. Sophie bolted from the apartment, her trembling hands gripping her worn jacket. The icy rain lashed against the city streets, but nothing could deter her from rushing toward the old garage. A thick darkness cloaked the urban sprawl around her, with only the dim flicker of a street lamp outside the garage casting a faint glow, like a distant signal drawing her nearer. She stopped before the rusted metal door, her heart thudding so fiercely it seemed it might shatter her ribs. Inside, the soft scrape of boots on concrete reverberated, as if someone or something awaited her arrival, perhaps sensing her approach. Sophie shoved the door open, its groans slicing through the oppressive quiet. There stood Milo, broad-shouldered and striking, his sharp gray eyes locking onto hers. At 25, Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat as she took slow, deliberate steps toward him. The air in the garage hung heavy, each breath and movement laced with an inexplicable weight. "You were waiting for me, weren't you?" Her voice emerged just above a whisper, fragile like a secret laid bare. Milo shifted slightly, a subtle tilt of his head that seemed to answer her. His gaze held something profound, an unspoken connection that rooted Sophie to the spot, unable to turn away. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly understood, in a way she never had with Ethan. A torrent of emotion surged through her, both soothing and dangerous. She reached out, her fingers brushing Milo's arm, the warmth of his presence seeping into her skin. It was like a jolt coursing through her, and in that instant, she knew her life had shifted forever. Outside, the rain pounded relentlessly, but Sophie barely registered it. The world beyond faded into a hush. There was only her, Milo, and a growing mystery weaving through the shadows, a spark ready to blaze. Sophie stood still, her hand resting lightly on Milo's arm, her eyes drifting into an unseen distance. She closed them and inhaled deeply, the scent of motor oil, wet pavement, and Milo's steady breathing filling her lungs. In this quiet refuge, she felt she'd escaped it all. The sterile apartment, Ethan's distant glances, and the gnawing isolation that had eroded her spirit for years. Memories flooded her like a storm. At 18, Sophie had believed love could overcome anything. She and Ethan, then 20, had been a wildfire, unstoppable, untwined. She remembered their first meeting, how Ethan's quick humor had left her laughing until her cheeks ached. She recalled late nights by the window, sharing dreams of a vibrant future. Back then, Ethan had vowed to stand by her, to build a life they'd both treasure. But those vows had faded over time. By 23, Ethan had buried himself in his career. Endless shifts at the hospital, rotations that stretched so long Sophie couldn't recall their last uninterrupted meal. Each time he returned, it was like welcoming a ghost. He'd shuffle in, drop his keys, offer a fleeting embrace, then vanish into his phone's glow. Sophie had fought to hold on, desperate to rekindle what they'd lost. But the more she tried, the more distant he became, his presence a hollow shell of the man she'd once known. Now, at 25, standing in the garage with Milo, Sophie felt the weight of those years lift. The connection she'd craved, the one Ethan could no longer offer, burned alive in Milo's steady gaze.